The sun hung low in the sky, casting a fiery red glow across the dry, cracked land. Sarah stood at the doorway of her small cabin, watching as her children, Tommy and Lila, played with makeshift toys in the dirt. Their laughter, once full of joy, now sounded hollow in the vast emptiness surrounding them. She tucked a loose strand of brown hair behind her ear, her eyes lingering on the horizon. Every day felt like a battle, against the land, against time, and against the weight of a life that seemed to have been dealt cruel hands. The wind picked up, carrying with it the dry scent of the plains. Sarah's throat tightened, and for a moment, she was taken back to the days before her husband's death. He had been her rock, a steady force in a world that seemed otherwise unforgiving. They had dreamed of building a life here, of turning the barren land into something they could call home. But now, only silence and dust remained where their dreams had once flourished. Her thoughts were interrupted by the creaking of a wagon, the sound echoing through the quiet air. The in-laws. Sarah's stomach churned at the thought. She knew they would come for her again. It was never just a visit. No, they were here to remind her that she was alone, abandoned. She had never quite fit into their world, and they made no secret of their disdain for her. The wagon slowed to a stop, and she could see her father-in-law's face scowling from the driver's seat. His grim expression sent a cold shiver through Sarah. He wasn't just coming to check on her. He was coming to make sure she understood her place. Her heart raced as she stepped back from the doorway, glancing at Tommy and Lila. They had no idea what was coming. "Ma, who's that?" Tommy asked, his small voice filled with innocence. He was only 6, but Sarah could see the growing fear in his eyes whenever the in-laws arrived. Lila, only a year younger, clutched her doll tightly, her gaze uncertain as she looked toward the wagon. "It's nothing, darling," Sarah said softly, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound calm. "Just some visitors." Her father-in-law dismounted and approached her with his usual air of superiority, his boots crunching against the earth as he walked toward the cabin. Behind him, her mother-in-law stepped down from the wagon, her face pinched in disapproval. They were the kind of people who saw nothing but failure in the struggles of others, and they had made their judgment clear long ago. "You're still here," her father-in-law said, his voice gruff, as if he were talking to a wayward child. "I told you, this place isn't fit for raising children. You should have left by now." Sarah bit her lip, fighting the wave of frustration that threatened to overtake her. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "This land is my home." Her mother-in-law scoffed, shaking her head. "Home? You can barely keep the roof from falling in. This place is nothing but a graveyard for your dreams. And those kids? You can't raise them here. It's a miracle they're even alive." The words hit Sarah like a slap to the face. She had heard it all before, but it never made it any easier. She glanced at Tommy and Lila, who were now standing beside her, their faces filled with confusion. Her heart ached for them. They didn't deserve to hear this. "Please, leave us be," Sarah said, trying to sound more resolute than she felt. "I don't need your help. I'll manage just fine." Her father-in-law's gaze hardened. "No, you won't. You've had your chance. You'll hand those children over, or you'll be on your own. We won't have you dragging the family name through the mud." Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she could feel the ground beneath her shaking. Her world was collapsing once again. She had lost her husband, her sense of security, and now it seemed as if she would lose her children as well. But something inside her snapped, an unfamiliar strength that she had long since buried under grief and fear. "I won't give up my children," she said, her voice low but unyielding. "They are mine, and I will protect them." Her father-in-law took a step closer, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "You'll regret that decision. We're through here. Don't come crawling back when you can't even feed them." With that, he turned and walked back to the wagon. His words were like daggers, but Sarah stood her ground. She couldn't let them see how much their cruelty hurt. She couldn't let them win. As the wagon rumbled away, Sarah watched them disappear into the distance, her heart still pounding in her chest. Her children tugged at her skirts, their faces full of fear. She knelt down to their level, pulling them close. "It's okay," she whispered, forcing a smile. "We're okay." But as Sarah gazed out at the endless stretch of land, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. How long could she keep going like this? Every day felt like an uphill battle, and the weight of the world pressed down on her shoulders. There had to be something more, something she could hold onto before the walls closed in completely. Just then, a noise interrupted her thoughts. The sound of hooves in the distance, faint but growing louder. Sarah's pulse quickened. Who could it be? She stood up, scanning the horizon. The silhouette of a man on horseback appeared, slowly becoming clearer. Her heart raced. Was it another visit from her in-laws? Or something else entirely? The rider came closer, his figure becoming more distinct as he neared the cabin. As the dust settled around him, Sarah realized this man was not like her father-in-law. There was something different about him, something raw yet unpolished. He rode with the ease of someone who had spent their life on horseback, his eyes scanning the land with a sharp awareness. Sarah held her breath as the rider drew nearer, his expression unreadable, his purpose unknown. And as he stopped in front of her cabin, she knew that her life was about to change forever. The man dismounted with a fluid motion, his eyes never leaving hers. He was tall, his face weathered but kind, and his clothes marked by hardship, just like hers. She could see the weariness in his eyes, the same kind she saw every day when she looked in the mirror. "I heard the commotion," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "You all right?" Sarah swallowed hard. She didn't know who this man was, or what he wanted, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. The man stood in front of Sarah, his horse grazing lazily behind him. His weathered face was marked by time and hardship, but his eyes, sharp and steady, spoke of something more. Something that had survived storms, both of nature and of the heart. He took a few steps closer, his boots kicking up the dry dust beneath them. His gaze flickered to Tommy and Lila, who were still huddled beside Sarah, their small faces curious but guarded. Sarah didn't know who this stranger was, or what he wanted, but she felt the weight of his presence. It was as though the air around them had thickened, pressing in on her chest, and for a moment she struggled to find her voice. It wasn't fear that held her back, but something else, a wariness born from years of dealing with those who had come into her life with promises only to leave her empty-handed. "I heard the argument," the man said, his voice low, almost gravelly, as if he'd been speaking little for a long time. "You all right?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at her children, who had instinctively moved closer to her. Lila's hand gripped the hem of her skirt tightly, while Tommy eyed the stranger with a mixture of intrigue and uncertainty. They had grown used to the harshness of life, but they were still children. They could not yet understand the danger or the relief that sometimes came with strangers. "I'm fine," Sarah finally said, her voice steady but laced with an edge. "It's just family matters. Nothing I can't handle." The man didn't seem convinced. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes flicking over her, taking in the weariness in her posture, the sadness etched into her features. He wasn't here to offer empty words or false promises. There was something about Sarah that made him pause, as if he could see beneath her hardened exterior to the exhaustion and grief she carried with her every day. "Family matters, huh?" he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her. He looked toward the road where the wagon had disappeared, then back to Sarah. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I've been around long enough to know when a woman's been run ragged." Sarah stiffened, the words hitting a nerve. She hadn't let herself feel the full weight of her struggle for so long. She had fought so hard, kept her head above the water long enough to shield her children from the worst of it, that the thought of anyone seeing the cracks in her armor made her uneasy. "You don't know me," she said, taking a step back. Her voice held a sharpness she hadn't meant to convey, but the idea of someone coming into her life so unceremoniously, poking at the raw parts of her existence, left her defensive. "You've got no business here." The man held his hands up in mock surrender, his lips curling into a slight, almost apologetic smile. "I ain't here to cause trouble," he said, his accent thick, heavy with the weight of the land he had been born to. "Just passing through. But looks like I can't do that without getting involved." Sarah's gaze hardened. She wasn't sure what this man wanted, but she couldn't afford distractions. Her in-laws were still a threat, she could feel their looming presence even after they had left. Their words still rang in her ears, sharp and cutting. She couldn't let anyone in. Not again. "I'm fine, really," she repeated, this time with more finality, but the man wasn't so easily dismissed. He took a step closer, his eyes softening, not in pity but with understanding. Sarah wasn't sure which was worse, being pitied or being seen for who she really was. "You're not fine," he said quietly, almost to himself. "This land's too harsh for you and them kids. Ain't nobody can make it out here alone." Sarah's heart clenched, and for a moment, she could almost taste the bitterness that had built up over the years. She had survived this long, alone, with only the fading memory of her husband and the cruel weight of her in-laws' judgments. She wasn't about to let a stranger tell her what she already knew. But there was something in his voice, something sincere, that made her pause. "Who are you?" she finally asked, her words more out of curiosity than trust. "And what do you want?" The man straightened, wiping his hand over his face as if to clear some of the dust and tiredness from his mind. His eyes softened as he looked at Sarah, and there was an almost imperceptible sigh that seemed to escape him, as if the weight of the world had pressed down on him, too, and he was just now acknowledging it. "Name's Jack," he said simply, without any bravado or false pride. "Been a widower for a few years now. Out here just trying to make a living." He paused, as if considering whether or not to say more. There was an air of vulnerability about him, something unspoken, a truth he wasn't yet ready to share. It was clear he wasn't the sort to flaunt his past, nor was he the type to ask for anything in return for his kindness. But there was something in his eyes, an understanding of loss and hardship that mirrored her own. "Look, I don't have much," Jack continued, his voice steady, "but I can offer help where I can. Maybe I can give you a hand fixing up that house of yours, or even just getting some supplies. No strings attached. Just offering what little I've got." Sarah stood still, her mind racing. His offer seemed too good to be true, yet something about it felt genuine. In a world where betrayal and cruelty often reigned, it was a rare thing to encounter kindness from a stranger. Jack wasn't asking for anything in return, not her gratitude, not her trust. But could she afford to accept help? Could she even trust him? The moment stretched, heavy with the weight of the decision. She wanted to refuse, to push him away and return to the solitude she had known for so long. But then she looked at Tommy and Lila, their faces full of hope, and something shifted inside her. She couldn't keep fighting this battle alone. Not anymore. "I'm not sure I can trust you," Sarah said, her voice low, but there was no bite in her words now. "But if you're offering, then I'll take what you can give." Jack nodded, his gaze flickering over her and the children. "I won't let you down," he said simply, and there was a quiet strength in his words that made her believe him, if only just a little. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Sarah knew that this encounter, this unlikely offer of help, had changed something inside her. The darkness of her situation hadn't disappeared, but for the first time in a long while, there was a flicker of light, an ember that might just burn bright enough to guide her through the storm. The next few days were a blur of hard work and silence, the kind that hung heavy in the air, broken only by the rhythmic sound of hammers striking wood and the occasional murmur of voices. Sarah, Tommy, and Lila had settled into a new routine, their days filled with small tasks to help Jack repair the cabin. The sense of urgency in Sarah's chest had lessened, but it hadn't disappeared. The in-laws' words still echoed in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their threat of returning was more than just empty talk. Jack had been a quiet presence, working alongside her with a focused determination. There was something unspoken between them, an understanding that neither of them had to voice. They both carried the weight of loss, and neither was quick to trust. But as the days wore on, Sarah noticed the way Jack's presence steadied her. There was something in the way he moved, purposeful yet unhurried, something in his gaze that spoke of survival, of fighting to keep going when all seemed lost. One afternoon, as they worked side by side, Sarah glanced over at him, wiping sweat from her brow. His face, though still weathered by hardship, held an expression of quiet strength. His hands, calloused and rough, moved with precision, and she couldn't help but feel a flicker of gratitude. He had given them shelter, offered his time without asking for anything in return, and in doing so, had brought a sense of normalcy, even if only for a short while. "You're good at this," Sarah said, her voice breaking the silence that had lingered between them. Jack didn't look up from the board he was securing but gave a small nod. "Gotta know how to fix things when you ain't got much." Sarah paused, considering his words. It was a simple statement, but there was a depth to it, something that told her Jack had spent most of his life trying to make do with what little he had. She thought about her own life, how she had once dreamed of a future built on love and partnership, only to find herself alone in a world that seemed to have no place for her. The thought made her throat tighten, and she quickly turned back to her work, trying to push the sting of it aside. The next day, the atmosphere shifted. The air seemed heavier, thicker with an approaching storm, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. She worked in silence, her eyes often darting to the horizon, watching for any sign of trouble. She knew the in-laws would come, and when they did, there would be no more pretending. It would be a fight for her children, for her home, for the life she was trying to build. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange, the sound of hooves reached Sarah's ears. Her heart skipped a beat, and she looked up, expecting to see the familiar figures of her in-laws returning with their threats. But it wasn't them. A rider appeared, silhouetted against the setting sun, his horse moving swiftly toward the cabin. Jack's hand instinctively went to the rifle slung across his back, but Sarah stopped him with a look. It wasn't the in-laws. But who could it be? She took a few steps forward, squinting against the glare of the sun, and as the rider came closer, she could see the figure more clearly. It wasn't a man she recognized, but there was something about the way he sat on his horse, the steady rhythm of the animal's gait, that made her uneasy. The rider dismounted with practiced ease, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell to his collar. His face was hard to read, but there was a certain confidence in his posture that told Sarah he was no stranger to danger. He walked toward her slowly, his gaze never wavering from hers, and Sarah's instincts flared. She didn't know what kind of trouble this man was bringing with him, but she could feel it creeping in like a shadow at dusk. "Evening, ma'am," he called out, his voice low but not unfriendly. He tipped his hat, but his eyes never left Sarah's. "I've come to speak with you." Jack stepped forward, his expression guarded. "What's this about?" The stranger glanced at Jack, then back at Sarah. "I'm looking for a woman named Sarah. I've been hearing rumors about your situation, and I've got business with you." Sarah's pulse quickened, and she felt the air around her grow colder. She had no idea who this man was or what business he could possibly have with her. But there was something about his presence that made her wary. Something that didn't sit right. "I don't know what you've heard," Sarah said, her voice steady though her stomach churned. "But whatever it is, I don't need any trouble. We're fine here." The man didn't seem convinced. He looked over his shoulder, as if to make sure no one else was watching, then stepped closer. "I ain't here to cause trouble. But you might be in more danger than you realize." Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She exchanged a brief glance with Jack, who stood tense, his hand still hovering near the rifle. The man's words hit her like a sudden gust of wind, cold and sharp. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man hesitated, as if considering how much to say. "I've heard word that your in-laws aren't done with you yet. They're coming back, and they won't stop until they get what they want." Sarah's heart sank. She had known, deep down, that they would return. The cruel words of her father-in-law echoed in her mind. But hearing it confirmed, seeing the stranger's eyes darken with the weight of the knowledge, made it all the more real. "I can help you," the man said, his voice low but firm. "But you'll need to trust me." Sarah's eyes flicked to Jack, who was still watching the stranger carefully. He hadn't said a word since the man had arrived, but she could feel the tension in his stance. She didn't know what to think. This was more than she had expected, and it felt like the storm was finally hitting, a force greater than anything she could have prepared for. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice steady though her pulse raced. The man smiled faintly, his expression unreadable. "Name's Cole, and I'm here to make sure you and your kids don't end up with nothing." The silence that followed his words was thick with uncertainty. Sarah's mind raced, torn between the fear of what was coming and the strange pull of something that felt like hope. She didn't know Cole, but the situation was beyond her control. There was no more pretending. "I don't have much choice, do I?" she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. Cole's eyes softened for the briefest moment. "No, ma'am. You don't." And as the final rays of sunlight faded, Sarah knew that the road ahead would be harder than anything she had faced before. But for the first time in a long while, she wasn't alone. The fight had just begun. The days that followed were marked by a quiet tension that hung in the air like the calm before a storm. Sarah and Jack, now working side by side with Cole's sudden arrival, had forged a fragile understanding. Each day their work grew harder, the stakes higher. Sarah couldn't ignore the weight of Cole's words. Her in-laws were coming back, and the fear of that inevitable confrontation gnawed at her. As the sun began its descent on another long day, Sarah found herself sitting outside the cabin, staring out at the horizon. The golden light of the evening bathed the land, but there was no comfort in its warmth. Her thoughts were heavy with all that had transpired, all that was yet to come. She thought of her children, their innocence, their vulnerability, and the constant fear that kept her awake at night. What kind of future could she offer them in this harsh, unforgiving world? Jack joined her after a while, his presence quiet but solid. He didn't speak right away, as if waiting for her to open up first. They had exchanged few words since Cole's arrival, but Sarah could feel the change in the air. Jack was no longer the stranger who had offered his help out of pity. He had become something more, something that Sarah wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. "You're thinking about them, aren't you?" Jack's voice broke the silence, his tone low but not unkind. Sarah didn't look at him, but nodded slowly. "I can't help it. They're coming back, Jack. I know it. I can feel it in my bones." Jack's hand brushed against his rifle, though his gaze remained steady. "I'll be here when they do. We'll stand together." The words should have brought Sarah some comfort, but instead, they stirred something deeper within her, a mixture of gratitude and doubt. She had always prided herself on her ability to stand alone, to shoulder the burden of her family's survival without asking for help. But this was different. The in-laws weren't just a threat to her. This time, they were after her children, and she couldn't protect them on her own anymore. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," Sarah said softly, her voice barely audible. Jack didn't respond right away. Instead, he shifted beside her, his eyes fixed on the distant landscape. "Strength isn't about standing alone. It's about knowing when you need someone else. You don't have to carry the weight of it all by yourself." Sarah didn't respond, but she felt something stir within her, an unfamiliar warmth, a flicker of hope. She had never allowed herself to rely on anyone, to trust that anyone could truly understand the depth of her pain. But Jack, he understood. She could see it in his eyes, feel it in the quiet moments they shared. He too had known loss. He too had learned how to survive when everything seemed to fall apart. As they sat there in the fading light, Sarah heard the soft rustle of hooves. The sound was distant at first, but it grew louder, closer. Her heart skipped a beat, and she stood up, her instincts immediately alert. Jack, too, was on his feet in an instant, his hand moving to the rifle slung across his back. "Stay behind me," Jack murmured, his eyes scanning the horizon. Sarah moved to stand beside him, her pulse quickening. She could see the dust rising in the distance, the shape of riders approaching. It wasn't the in-laws, not yet. But whoever it was, they were coming fast, and they weren't here for a friendly visit. The riders emerged from the dust, their silhouettes hard against the setting sun. There were 4 of them, all on horseback, their faces obscured by wide-brimmed hats and scarves. They moved with the practiced ease of men who had spent their lives in the saddle, their eyes sharp and calculating. Sarah felt a pang of dread in her chest. These weren't just wanderers or travelers. These were men with a purpose. Jack stepped forward, his posture rigid, his hand still resting on his rifle. "What do you want?" he called out, his voice steady but carrying a weight of authority that Sarah had never heard from him before. The leader of the riders pulled his horse to a halt, his eyes scanning the small cabin and the 2 people standing before him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar running across his cheek that made his face look even harder than it already was. "We're looking for a woman named Sarah," the man said, his voice gruff, but his tone wasn't threatening yet. "Word has it she's been causing some trouble." Sarah's stomach dropped. She took a step forward, her eyes narrowing as she faced the leader. She couldn't be sure, but something about the way he said her name felt like a warning. Her mind raced, connecting the dots between Cole's earlier words and these men's sudden appearance. "I'm Sarah," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "What business do you have with me?" The leader's gaze shifted to her children, who were standing just inside the cabin, peeking out from behind the door. His eyes lingered on them for a moment before he spoke again. "We've been sent by your family. They want you and your kids gone." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The in-laws had come to collect what they believed was theirs. They hadn't just abandoned her, they had set the wheels in motion to take her children from her, to remove her from the land she had fought so hard to protect. The realization hit her with the force of a punch, but she didn't let it show. She couldn't. Jack stepped forward, his body tense, his hand still on his rifle. "You can tell them we won't be leaving. You'll have to go through us first." The leader didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see about that." With a signal, the riders dismounted, their movements coordinated and practiced. Sarah's heart raced as she took a step back, instinctively reaching for Tommy and Lila, who were now clutching each other in fear. Her mind screamed for a plan, for some way to protect them, but all she had were the few meager tools around her, and the man who had offered her help. She wasn't prepared for this. But Jack was. "Get inside," he ordered Sarah quietly, his voice steady. "Now." The tension in the air was thick, suffocating, and Sarah knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Her in-laws had sent these men, and they weren't leaving without a fight. She could feel it in her bones. The storm had finally arrived, and there was no turning back.